Hello, I'm Dr. Allan Gates, and you are with the Caretakers Journey podcast.
Welcome to this week's show. I am your host, Carole Leathem, and we are in our final episode 4 of a series that Allan and I are doing on mental illness from a Christian's perspective. And we have defined mental health. We have talked about what it looks like from a caretaker's perspective. Last week, we talked about what the different types of professionals were. We kind of dove a little bit. We kind of dipped our toe into the idea of medication and some of the struggles about that. And this week, Allan and I are back to talk about the church, because the church is, and we did kind of talk a little bit about it last week, but we're going to really dive into this and hopefully talk about some of the things that we as people in the church, because the church is people, can do to encourage. So I want to welcome Allan to the show. And Allan, why don't you share with us one of your favorite hobbies or two? Share with us something you like to do in your off time.
Well, as you know, one of your pastors is a big OU football fan.
Yes.
And that comes with the territory being in Oklahoma. So I am a big football fan. I watch college football, and I get to do that with your pastor at times too. So that's a fun thing I get to do, is watch college football and involved in that, and go to grandkids sporting events. So I like to do that. I just came back from Houston, where my son runs triathlons, does the biking and the swimming and the running.
Wow.
So they bike, he swam 2.5 miles. He runs 100, not 100 miles, 26 miles, runs a marathon, and then bikes, I don't know how many miles. But it was so hot in Houston that I had to go to the hotel and lay down while those guys were doing the
Is this the Iron? Is this the Ironman? The Ironman competitions? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I have a really close friend, and her husband runs those, and we have been Team Dave on a couple of occasions while he's doing his. I am impressed. That is crazy.
It is, yeah. I used to jog, and then I prayed I'd get hurt so I could stop, and so finally I did.
oh, that's so funny. No, I do go to the gym 5 mornings a week and do a pretty intense strength training. And it was funny because somebody told me one time, well, you don't do any cardio. And I'm like, I would challenge you to come do my 30-minute strength training and say you don't do cardio.
There you go.
There are times I am laying on the floor and I can't breathe. So
part of taking care of yourself, I would guess.
Yes, it is. It is. It's what I do to make it a priority. I started about 3 years ago. I just woke up one day and I said, I don't feel good, and I'm tired, and my muscles hurt, and I'm not doing active. I'm not active. And so I had watched this particular trainer train my daughter for a couple of years, and I had seen the transformation. And I'm telling you, it has made a huge difference in my senior citizen body.
Yeah, good.
Really. So this week I want to really unpack what mental health looks like in the church, how as people in the pew, we can encourage and support. Because one of the statistics that you said was that there 1/4 of the people in our pews struggle. And I see that because people are starting to, in my church especially, start to understand that this is kind of my world, and they're seeking me out. And I've gotten involved in a couple of secular organizations here in Bakersfield and one religious organization, and just really wanting to understand how we as a church, what are our response? And we talked a little bit about going to our pastor, looking for a counselor, and how our pastors should find our counselors. So I'm going to be making a contact with our pastors and going, hey, do you have a list of counselors? Because I have people all the time asking me for counselors.
Exactly.
And if they say, well, no, we don't, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to call Allan, and you're going to get in trouble.
And your staff knows me too.
I know. I know the staff of my church knows you, Allan. And so if they say, no, we don't have a list, I'm going to sick you on them.
That's good.
It is so important. It is so important. So we talked about Jesus and mental health last week.
Yeah.
But,
Yep.
in the book of Galatians, and I've heard you talk about this on other shows, there's a scripture in Galatians that talks about how we should carry each other's burdens.
Right.
And I heard you say that the definition of carrying our burdens is carrying our load. So,
Yep.
so what are some practical ways that we as a church or church member can
Yep.
help to carry the burden of someone who's struggling with mental illness?
Right. So that's a scriptural command,
Mm-hmm.
is to do that. And when we see someone with mental illness in our church, our natural reaction is to run from them as far
Yes.
as we can get.
Yes.
Right. So we're not obeying God's word, first of
Mm-hmm.
all. Secondly, getting involved with people's lives is messy. And that person with mental illness is messy. But there are all kinds of ways we can help them by getting them connected with community resources, but also loving them. And
Mm-hmm.
I use the acronym LOVE, LUV. And that
Okay.
stands for L, listening,
Okay.
U, understanding,
Ooh, okay.
and V, validating.
Oh, okay. Break those down.
Listening. We need people to listen to us, to listen with their heart, not with
Mm-hmm.
their head, not trying to solve all of our problems. That's not listening.
Mm-hmm.
Listening is empathy, being able to get into that other person's experience and see what it's like to be them. And
Mm.
Jesus did that, by the way.
Wow.
Listening, you understanding. Sometimes, and I tell marital couples all the time, there's three magic words in marriage therapy: help me understand.
I
And
love that.
because we want to be listened to, we want to be understood by
Yeah.
our spouse. You know,
Yeah.
there's a huge difference between agreeing and understanding.
Mm-hmm.
We don't agree all the time, and we shouldn't, but we should strive to understand.
Yeah.
And whether that be someone's mental illness or someone's physical problems or someone's emotional problems, on and on, we should be able to focus on understanding. So L is listening, U is understanding, V is validating. You know, it is an incredible thing to validate another human being,
Oh,
to
wow.
validate that they are a significant person to God. And if they're significant to God, we as God's hands and feet need to treat people as being significant.
Wow. Well, I will tell you, just hearing you talk about validation brings up all kinds of emotions inside of me because I would say that, church hurt. There's a
Yeah.
lot going on right now about church hurt, spiritual
Yeah.
abuse, but I would say that I'm still sort of walking through some hurt within the church about the lack of validation
Sure.
and really the lack of all of it, the lack of listening, the lack of understanding,
Yeah.
and the lack of validation. And yeah, I just felt when you said that, I just felt my whole system. You know how it is when you go, ooh,
Yeah.
that's something
Yeah.
I need to work on that
Yeah.
because
Because
it's painful.
yeah, because what we want to do is say, hey, brother or sister, let me pray for you. Okay, see ya.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And not get involved in their lives. And
Yeah.
I use this little illustration to say what Jesus did was he did three things with people. He listened,
Hmm.
he did something helpful,
Yeah.
and he walked with them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I use this illustration in our backyard. We're just blessed to have a not really nice backyard. And in our backyard, I have this chair, and in this chair that I sit in, a yard chair, I can see the sun rise every morning. And so
Mm.
I'll go out there in the morning, the cool of the morning, and pray and do my quiet time with the Lord. But I can see the sunrise, right?
Hmm.
Now there's some days that there are clouds that cover the sun.
Okay.
That's like having sadness. That's not depression.
Oh.
Because when the clouds cover the sun, I know for a fact the sun is behind the clouds. God's there.
Yeah.
I know for a fact.
Yeah.
That's sadness. So trying as a church member, understand the difference between sadness and depression. When you say I'm
Mm,
depressed, you're not depressed. You're
right.
sad.
Right.
Depression is a brain disorder.
Disorder.
Right. So when I'm sitting there in that chair and the clouds cover the sun, I know for a fact the clouds are going to leave at some point
Yes.
and the sun's going to shine or God's going to be there.
Yeah.
That's the definition of sadness,
Right. That makes
right?
sense. Okay.
Sometimes I'm sitting in that chair and the storms happen and the clouds and Oklahoma, we're famous for tornadoes, and
Yeah.
there's this darkness that happens. Depression means I don't think that there's God behind there. I don't think the sun is ever going to shine again.
Oh, wow.
That's the disorder of depression.
Wow.
And so I need someone to walk with me, someone to listen, someone to do something helpful, right?
Mhm.
So for depressed people, that's their thinking process. That's where they've gotten
Mm.
to in their brain is God's not going to be there. No one is going to come and help me. No
Mm.
one understands. And people with sadness, regular church members, we experience
Yeah.
sadness. We experience worrisome thoughts. We don't have the disorder of depression or disorder
Yeah.
of anxiety. So when you encounter as a church member someone with depression, don't say, I know exactly how you feel. You don't.
Yeah, you
You
don't.
have no clue. Yes, you understand sadness, but you do not understand the disorder of depression,
Wow. That is,
right?
yes. A few years ago, I was speaking at an event, and I was sharing the platform with a national speaker that I was so excited to meet personally. I loved their
Ah,
ministry, I loved their writing, I loved their speaking, and I was so excited to meet this woman personally. And I didn't like go up and kind of force myself into her world, because I'm just not like that. But I was standing in the front of the stage at this event, and this woman just walked over, and I was talking to somebody else, and she just walked over, and she walked right into our conversation. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was almost fangirling just a little bit, but I was
sure.
trying to control it because I was so excited that God had brought her into my presence. And so she started asking me, she asked me my name, and I told her. And then I noticed that she was a little distracted while she was like not like making eye contact. And then she said, well, tell me about yourself. And I said, well, I was a pastor's wife for such and such a years until my husband was forced to retire. And then we moved to Bakersfield. And now now we live in Bakersfield and whatever. And she goes, huh. She goes, you used a word there that I want to know more about. She goes, what do you mean your husband was forced to retire? And I said, well, my husband struggles with mental illness. He was forced to retire because he struggles with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And she looked at me and she goes, I'm really sorry I asked you that question right now. And I really don't want to know anymore. And
What?
yeah, she said that. And it was like,
Exactly.
it was it was so disheartening, because this is a woman to this day who is still on stages teaching and speaking. And I've never spoken, I've told the story, but I've never said her name, and I won't ever say her name. But I thought, how sad is it? And I walked away, and for a moment, now it's my responsibility to know how I'm going to do with this. But it showed me how easily the church hurts the church, because we are the
Yeah.
people in the church. So
Yeah.
what?
And we're to and we obviously are to love each other,
Yeah.
right? So I'm sorry, but you made me think of a story that
Oh, go
happened to
ahead,
me
please
with
jump in.
another church person, where a church person hurt me. I was speaking at a national conference. I was the warm up band, right? I
Okay.
was speaking before the main speaker, and so it was a marriage conference, and the subject I was talking about was working on expectations and learning how to validate one another and that kind of thing. So I got through, and then I went to the green room, and he spoke. And he has written, if I said his name, you'd know exactly who it is.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the world would know who it is because he's big time. And I was talking about unconditional love. And he came off the stage, and there were actually 1,000 couples. So it
Oh,
was a huge event,
wow.
right?
Okay.
So he came off the stage, and I said, "Well, you just set people up for failure." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "There's no unconditional love in marriage relationships."
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, obviously you don't see people for a living. You just are a pastor and you go around writing marriage books." I didn't say that, but wanted to. But anyway,
Well, you can say
I
it here.
said, "That's right." I said, "Because unconditional love means that you have unconditional acceptance for another person's behavior."
Mm,
And and only God can do that. We
yes.
as humans don't aren't can't do that. And he said, "Well, how many marriage books have you written?" And he said, "I've written 25." And guess who never got invited to speak again with that guy?
you know, I have
So
a
we in the church need to have love for one another, but not unconditional love. So
right.
I'm not talking about being able to accept a person's behavior, but we are called to love one another. And that means a helping process. Wouldn't
Yes.
you think?
Yes. And I think that we can respect each other. We can have respect for each other, but not acceptance. And
Yeah.
sometimes the acceptance doesn't come because of the lack of understanding. And what I've discovered is, and especially through our four episodes here, is when you have a brain disorder that people can't see,
Yeah.
and and a person can't identify what it is, they're
Yeah.
going to, because your mind goes to try to find the answers and isn't going to calm down until it comes up with an answer. They always come up with the wrong answer. And hopefully
Yeah.
now people will say, "Oh, that's a brain disorder." And
Yeah.
I watch in church, um and I am in an incredible supportive community, life group community at my church. My church is really, life group communities are extremely important to our pastors, and they encourage most of the ministry and the care to happen within our life group communities.
Right.
And I am in a life group community now that is just amazing, and they have embraced my husband and I. A few of them have gotten my book. I know that it has shocked them because they have never come back, because they've never come back and talked to me about my book.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting because I wrote my book from a very real, transparent way, and my book won an award last summer. In Yes,
Congratulations.
in a writing competition, and I have the plaque for it. But what I've noticed is that most people don't want to accept that my marriage was messy and it had some
Yeah.
problems, but I did not write the book as a expose, tell all, slander my husband. My husband wrote the foreword. He agreed to everything. But
Yeah.
in my church, I know that there are people who struggle, but people who have found my book, who are one of those four people in the pew. I saw a couple on Sunday who the wife struggles and the husband is the caretaker.
Oh
And
boy.
that is so rare, Allan, because
Powerful.
I can probably count on both hands the number of relationships that I have met where the husband is the caretaker and is staying and encouraging, because most of the time I'm finding that the husband doesn't stay. The wife will stay, but the husband does not stay because it gets too messy. It's too hard. It's whatever.
Yeah.
And I admire this couple so much because they own their brain disorder
Yeah.
and have found a way to love and give back. And
Wow.
one of the things I think that I have learned is that when you are in the situation where you're a caretaker, one of the things that I've learned is serving has really helped me not only find my community, but it's helped me to understand that God still has a purpose for me. And so, what
Yes.
kind of groups at church can the church create that can help the person who's struggling with mental illness? How
Right.
can we support that person first, the
Right.
person who's got the brain disorder?
Yeah. So providing them a community with folks that are like them.
Okay.
And that, but we've popularized support groups like Celebrate Recovery, for
Yes.
example, Hurts, Habits, and Hangups,
Mm-hmm.
where people can come together because mental illness drives us into isolation,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And it drives caretakers
Yes.
into isolation.
Yes.
So having support groups of people that are like you who can talk about the commonalities, who can talk
Mm-hmm.
about pitfalls, who can encourage one another to be able to go on, to be able to talk about coping skills,
Mm-hmm.
survival techniques. Those are the kinds of things that are helpful. It's also helpful when very few pastors speak on mental illness. It's a it's
I've never heard a sermon, not that I'm criticizing my church, but I've never
Yeah,
heard a sermon in my church on I've never heard a sermon on mental illness.
and I've been fortunate enough to speak in several churches, and it is very uncommon.
Mm-hmm.
And the feedback that the church will get, the pastors will get, is finally someone has allowed me now to be able to talk about my mental illness. Thank you, Pastor, so much for bringing so and so, bringing me in, or somebody to talk about those kinds of issues.
So one of the things that I am currently doing, Allan, and I'm actually going to test it. One of my close friends, she and her husband pastor in Tennessee, and
Ah,
they have embraced not only me, but they have embraced my story and they've embraced the ministry that I have. And so I have developed a 1-day conference called for the caregiver, where caregivers can come on a Saturday morning or Friday morning or whatever to a conference, get coffee, because I'm a coffee girl, get coffee,
absolutely.
and let's have some teaching and some conversation. And then let's get around the table and let's share. Let's talk about coping mechanisms. Let's talk about, and then doing a question. So we're developing. I've developed a 1-day conference, and we're going to unveil it at their church in the spring.
That is
And
amazing.
I'm praying that God will open the door for more churches to do something like that, because 1 in 4 people in our pews are living in isolation.
Yeah,
And it actually, when you think about it, 1 in 4 people have the diagnosis. Now we're talking about 50% of the people, because most of those 1 in 4 people have a caretaker. So
good
now we're
point.
talking about 50% of the people in our church, Allan,
Yeah,
that this is touching on their lives.
the
And
church has to be the perfect place for imperfect people.
oh, I love that.
Right? I
Yes.
mean, we have to understand that and accept that. And, rather than, putting on our Sunday school face and acting like our world is wonderful when we're falling apart, whether we're struggling with mental illness or financial problems
Yeah.
or, we're seeing that more, right? With Financial Peace
Oh,
University
yeah.
and Grief Share and some of those things we're starting to really understand and accept the fact that we all have problems and we all have struggles, right?
Yeah.
And the problem in the church has been we don't know how to struggle.
Yeah, we don't.
We act like everything's okay.
Yes.
And so maybe we just struggle with how to struggle and right
Yeah.
and so maybe that's what we need to do is just to be honest with that. And that's one of the things that you've done with your podcast is you bring people on who will talk honestly about things. And that's what you've been able to do. People appreciate
Oh,
that.
thank
People
you.
want to have honesty. They want to be encouraged. And
Thank
that's
you.
what they've been able to do when they've gotten a chance to listen to you.
Well, thank you so much for that. So let's just, as we close out today, let's just
Yep.
talk for a second about the 10 hardest issues for pastors in the church to deal with.
I think number one is their own family.
Oh, okay.
I think pastors struggle with their own family. That is one of the hardest issues in terms of because they know their family's not perfect.
Yeah.
And the church knows kinda that their family's not perfect, but
Yeah.
everyone wants to ignore that
Yeah.
or act like it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So there's this false pretense that everything is going to go well and everything's perfect. So
Okay.
definitely, I think pastors struggle with that. Secondly, I think they struggle with the notion of counseling
Oh.
in terms of what do I do? How
Mm-hmm.
do I counsel with people? And again, I've just been wonderfully blessed to be able to do consultation with pastors and pastors groups and get to speak at some pastors conferences where I've been able to talk about how do you get training? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's what they need, right? People
Yeah.
need to be trained. They have maybe one class in seminary.
Yeah.
I mean, did you guys have any counseling classes in seminary that you can remember?
I don't think he did. Yeah. I don't think
Yeah,
he did. Mm-mm.
yeah, yeah. And that's common, right? And then they're supposed to have all the answers when
Yeah.
people come to them with real life problems.
Mm-hmm.
I think another issue they struggle with is loss.
Oh.
Loss when their congregation has loss, like loss of a child, for example,
Mm-hmm.
when a child gets killed unexpectedly or
Yeah.
dies unexpectedly. I think those kinds of things pay a huge toll on our pastors.
Yeah.
I think pastors struggle with their own finances,
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
right? Because we normally don't pay pastors very well,
That is true.
and so we create struggling for them in those areas. So I think their own death of a loved one, their own mortality, their
Mm-hmm.
own how do you give explanations to problems?
Yeah.
How do you understand why God does certain things in his word and how God allows bad things to happen to good people, and
Yeah.
all of those huge questions that are very human. I think those are some of the things that pastors struggle with, and thereby knowing that, we as the body of Christ need to pray for them.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
and the other thing that I would encourage us to do in closing, Carole, is I would encourage each one of us who listen to this podcast get in touch with a caretaker and
Mm-hmm.
help them through the process. Three things which Jesus did: listen to caretakers,
Mm-hmm.
do something helpful, and three, walk with them
Yeah.
through the process.
Yeah. And the thing that is so important, and I have some people who have done that for me and continue to do that for me because my journey is still ongoing and it's even expanded now with the caring for my family, my
Yeah,
extended family, my mom, and having to travel and all of the just the chaos that the life brings and the financial, my car had to have brakes. How the heck am I going to pay for the brakes?
right.
And people think, oh, you live with your daughter, life should be
Yeah,
fine. And they don't understand that my husband retired 15 years before he planned.
right.
And
And you didn't get rich off your podcast?
no, I make nothing off the podcast because I refuse to monetize the podcast.
It is a ministry. It
But,
is a
but
real
yes,
ministry.
but here's what I've learned. God does show up. And when God
Yes.
asks you to do something, he's going to take care of you. And I have had several friends who got together and bought the equipment so that I could start the podcast
That's
because they
awesome.
wanted me to do it. And now my speaking engagements are starting to come back. And those are the things that make the difference. But what I have learned, and these are probably the four things that I really, really, really believe that God has shown me, number one, I'm not alone. And if you're a caretaker out there, you're not alone. And one of the ways that you can encourage a caretaker, share the podcast with them, share my contact information with them. I respond to emails and text messages. My phone number is all over the internet. You can call me. I may not pick up, but you can leave me a message or you can text me. I'm a texter and an emailer. That's pretty much my response. But you're not alone, and don't isolate. You've
Good.
touched on that yourself, but
Yep.
I have a tendency to be an isolator. And I have a couple of girls in my life who, if they have not heard from me for a couple of days, will call me and go, "Hey, what's going on? Did you
That's
take
good.
a shower recently?" If you want to know if you're isolating, here's how I find out if I'm isolating or not. If I have to stop and think too long about when I took a shower the last time and washed my hair, that means I'm isolating.
Yeah, it's good.
And if I cannot just go, "Oh yeah, I took a shower yesterday morning," if I can't say that, then that means that I'm starting to that slippery slope. The slippery slope of isolation is there.
That is
You
good.
have to ask for help. And
Good.
sometimes the hardest thing I can do is pick up a phone and say, "Hey, you want to go have coffee? Hey, you want to go have lunch?" Because people are busy. I'm not at the forefront of their mind. And they're not going to just think, "Oh, Carole probably needs to go out to lunch." And I need to ask. The other thing you also touched about is that you have to get outside in the sunshine and nature.
Yep.
And I go out. I had a guest on my podcast early on who talked about what happens in our brains when we go outside at sunrise barefoot and stand on the grass and watch the sunrise, and how it resets our brain. And that's so critical. And then to understand that God sees you.
Yep.
He's right there in the middle of your chaotic mess. And I think that it's so important for us to remember that God sees us. And so I'm so thankful for you these last 4 weeks as we've had this conversations.
Thank you for blessing me and honoring me by letting me be on your podcast.
Well, you're going to come back because we have to talk about that cognitive thing. I'm not going to let that drop. And people are going to come back and they're going to email me. I'm going to get emails. And we're now in 7 countries. Our podcast is now in 7 countries. And you can Google and find it. And it's like scaring the bejeebus out of me. Because I wanted it to just kind of float under the radar, and it's not happening. And so, people are going to go, "We want to know about that cognitive thing." And so if you're going to get emails, I'm going to get emails, and you're going to come back on, Allan, and we're going to talk some more. But as we close out, I believe that self-care is critical, and we've done this the last 3 weeks. So I'm going to ask you the question again. Allan, what are you going to do in the next 24 hours to take care of you?
I am going to have a Dr. Pepper and add some strawberry ice cream. And then I'm unfortunately going to have to walk for 2 miles with my wife when she gets home from work.
Dr. Pepper, that is an Oklahoma thing, isn't it?
It is.
Oh my gosh. Well, Allan, thank you so much. Thank you. The link to your email and your books are going to be in the show notes so people can reach out to you. And I am going to go and find out from my pastors if they have a list of counselors. And if they don't, I'm going to sick you on them for that. I'm going to say, "Well, Allan said," because I know that you know our pastors very well.
Yep.
Well, if you as a listener today have not listened to the other 3 episodes, if you're just diving into this one today, go back and listen to episodes 1, 2, and 3 of my conversation with Allan. I promise you will not only be blessed, but you will understand mental illness from a whole new perspective as being a brain disorder. And that will change the way that if we would all latch onto that would change seismically the landscape of mental health in our world. So please do that. And if you would like to know more about my personal journey with caretaking, the link to my website and my social media and my book, Are You Ready to Find Joy When Life Gets Chaotic, is in the show notes as well. I'll be back next week for another meaningful conversation about what it looks like to be on the caretaker's journey. And until then, it's all about Him.